So this lesson is on the Jewish returns. And with the Jewish returns, they start with Cyrus the Great. They were prophesied to be done by Cyrus the Great. Once Cyrus defeats Babylon, which we talked about last time, then his empire, he just kind of absorbs and gains control of everything that Babylon was in control of. And so at that point, his empire becomes the largest empire in the world up to date at that time. And so he has Pasargadae and Persepolis. These are the two cultural centers of the Persian Empire. And that's why they're called Persians, because of Parsa, or Persepolis. But once they've conquered all of this, most of the political seats are Babylon, Susa, and Ecbatana. Ecbatana was where the Medes had their capital. And of those three, Babylon ends up actually being more of the place where the king stayed. It was more central, plus it was more luxurious and more prestigious, which is why you find Daniel still in Babylon, still with Darius the king, although we'll talk about different ways that could be understood. Judah is actually much even smaller than this once it gets reinstated, but it becomes just a area being overseen by the Persian Empire. And now Cyrus, after conquering to this point, he is the one that lets them go back. So Cyrus was a very skilled ruler. And one of the things that he is very well known for, and one of the reasons why he's referred to as Cyrus the Great, is because he's kind of the first ruler to come in and be a respecter of everybody else's culture and religion. So especially in our modern day, that's highly looked up to. What you had the Assyrians, whose policy was when you conquer a people, you take them, you transplant them and spread them all out so that they are not in a homeland. There's nothing they want to defend. They get intermixed, they lose their identity, then they won't rebel against you. That was the idea of the Assyrians. The Babylonians tended to capture people and transplant them, some to Babylon, although it wasn't necessarily a major policy that they always transplanted people, but they definitely did that with the Jews. Then when you get to Cyrus the Great ends up letting many of those people go back to where they were from. Not just the Jews, but the Jews are definitely the predominant ones. It's hard to say whether the Jews started that process and then he started doing it with other cultures as well. Or some might argue that he was already doing that, so it's not a big deal that he did it with the Jews. The honest truth is that no matter what, it started with the Jews because God prophesied it 300 years ahead of time that he'd be doing it. And we'll see that in a second in the passage. So he conquered three empires. So he defeated the Medes because he was king of Persia. He defeated the Medes, overthrowing his grandfather. And then he defeated Croesus, the king of Lydia. And Lydia is at the very end, western end of Turkey, and was a very rich and wealthy kingdom. And when he conquered them, he fought against them, and then it got to where it was winter and it's time that you would normally stop fighting. And so Croesus went back and said, well, I guess we're done. And Cyrus was like, nope, we're not done. And he just kept right on going. And then what they did with the horses is Croesus used camels, and they put the horses at a place where it would spook. They used camels. Croesus was using horses. They put camels at a place where it would spook the enemy cavalry, so the cavalry were taken out of the battle. Some interesting strategy that they had. And then he also defeated Babylon. So now these three empires that he defeated might possibly be the three ribs in the mouth of the bear. But since the unevenness of the bear is already like the Medes and the Persians, The third rib is usually seen as being Egypt, which is going to be conquered by, I think, Cambyses or Darius in just a slide or two. Now, one of the interesting things about the story of Cyrus is within the writings of the Persians, Cyrus was predicted by a prophet to take over the kingdom of the Medes. And so his grandfather, who was king of the Medes, commanded that he be put to death. And so he, almost like a Cinderella thing, he gave the child to one of his servants. The servant couldn't put the child to death. And so instead gave him to somebody who would raise him. And then Cyrus was raised by that person and then becoming the king of Persia. And then he ends up being discovered that he's alive. I don't remember if that's before he became king of Persia, but it was discovered that he was alive. And the king who wanted him put to death to get revenge on the man who didn't obey him and put him to death, called him to a banquet and served him meat, only to find out that it was his son. And he found that out by the king brought out the head and the hands of his son so that he knew what he had just eaten. And so that shows you some of the harshness of things back then. So you have Cyrus coming to power. He ends up defeating Babylon, which we covered last week. And the people in Babylon were not very loyal to Nabonidus, as we talked about, because they were upset on how he had thwarted their religion and stuck his nose up at them. So he defeats the armies of Babylon at Opis, enters Babylon pretty much as a liberator, and then at this point becomes the largest empire of that time. So this is the prophecy in Isaiah. It's Isaiah 44:28, which is it's the last verse of that chapter, and then into 45. And God says of Cyrus, and the word Cyrus here in Hebrew, it'd be pronounced Koresh. Does that sound familiar? David Koresh? So the reason David Koresh called himself David Koresh was because he felt that he was the anointed that was fulfilling this prophecy, and he took the son David, or the name David, because he saw himself as a descendant of King David. But he says, God who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purposes. All my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple, your foundation shall be laid. Thus says the Lord to his anointed. Now, this is an interesting thing, because this is the word anointed, Mashiach, which we get Messiah from, is typically used of the high priest, and it was used of Saul, and I think once of David. But otherwise, it's not a very common word in the Old Testament. It occurs, I think, in Daniel 9, and then here in Isaiah. Otherwise, it's very, it's fairly rare. And here it's being used of Cyrus, a Gentile king who doesn't even know God. And so it's kind of interesting. You get the concept of the one that's anointed is just chosen by God ahead of time. And so you say, the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, and to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed. I will go before you and level the exalted places. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hoards in secret places, that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who call you by your name, for the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel my chosen. I call you by your name. I name you, though you do not know me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I equip you, though you do not know me, that people may know from the rising of the sun from the west, that there is none besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. So this is one of the more powerful prophecies that God, by name, selects 300 years prior to this who is going to set the Jews free and bring them back in. It is quite likely, in fact, I'm trying to think, I think Josephus actually says that this was read to Cyrus. And Cyrus was, amazed by that. In fact, I think it's in Ezra. I think Ezra, when you had the declaration of Cyrus, he references this prophecy. And so that's why I would lean to the fact that this prophecy was there and it led Cyrus to have this policy, and that from there he may have done more after the fact. Now, one interesting thing, this is just a little Dwayne point here, nothing authoritative at all, but you have basically Daniel having the one vision. He's calling, he's asking for an answer from God. Michael the archangel comes and he says, I'm sorry I was delayed 3 weeks because of conflict with the prince of Persia. And you're like, what's going on? One thought I have with that is the idea that Michael, as the kind of the archangel of Israel, he's kind of seen as that, was there working in the spiritual influences within Persia to bring about this policy and to bring about this this prophecy being fulfilled. Like I said, totally Dwayne thing, but we consider what would he be wrestling with the Prince of Persia over. So the idea that you might see there is how how the angels are used to influence spiritually, even in secular places, to achieve the things that God is wanting to happen. And that might be what was, Michael was up to at that point. So after Cyrus, you have Cambyses the second, and so he reigns for 8 years. He was the son of Cyrus the Great and had served as the deputy of Babylon. Now, this is where understand, like with these names, like with the name Cyrus, his king name was Cyrus. Just like with the British, when somebody goes from like Prince Charles, if he becomes king, he's not going to be King Charles. He's going to be some, like King George, or he'll change his name to one of the king names. And there would be a Median name and a Persian name. And I can't remember, I think Cyrus is more the Median name and Darius is like more of a Persian name or something like that. But you go back and forth between Cyrus and Darius and so on and so forth. So when you get to Daniel in the lion's den with Darius, the king, and he's in Babylon, it's like, well, is that the king of Persia? It might have been, because Babylon was a central political hub. It could also be somebody who was put in the position, like here, of Cambyses, where he was the deputy over Babylon. So he's a prince, but he's the king of Babylon under his father, Cyrus. And he may have had the name Darius, and then it was changed to Cambyses. I'm not saying that was the case, but it's like that's how some of these things happen, where the names are there, because some people kind of challenge, who is the Darius. It could possibly have been the next king, who is King Darius, Darius the Great. That makes Daniel quite old at that point, but not beyond possibility. So, but it was probably during this time that Daniel in the lion's den is happening, either from Cyrus, Cambyses, or Darius. So Cambyses is the one who conquers Egypt. He had killed his brother Smerdis just to stay on the throne and to ensure it was his. And then after he conquers Egypt, now the empire is even larger. And so you now have probably definitely the most powerful empire up to that time. Again, and this is why Egypt might be that third rib in Daniel 7. So his death, he was actually camped at Mount Carmel on his way back from Egypt. And he was informed that a person named Gaumata had seized the throne and was pretending to be his deceased brother that he had killed. And so then Cambyses experiences a sudden death. So suicide or murder was most likely what happened there. Then you have Darius Histasis, which is Darius the Great. He was one of Cambyses' officers, and he's from a secondary branch of the royal line. He's not the Gaumata. He ends up taking out that rebellion and putting it down. He was a very capable ruler and just kind of picked up the army from where it was and went back, took down the insurrection, seized the throne. But then because of that, there's others that were like, he's weak, now's the time to rebel. So they all rebel, and he puts down all of those. And then he records it on a cliff near Ecbatana. So you can go today to Iran, and on a cliff you'll see where Darius inscribed all these victories over the people he put down and took care of it. It's on a giant carving into the side of the cliff. And so he takes on the empire, and he reorganizes it and structures it so that it can actually handle the size that it is. It's very hard to administrate an empire like that when you don't have phones, you don't have cars, you don't have something that can travel fast. So he reorganizes it and creates good communication and who has what responsibilities, puts judges over certain areas, and actually creates a postal service. And we're going to talk saying he's the one who is defeated at the Battle of Marathon. Now, one of the biggest things he did for the postal thing is he created a road. And this empire road kind of sets somewhat of an example to the Romans, and the Romans then pick up from this, and Roman road building becomes a huge thing. It's necessary to administer things with the empire. So this was a road that was done so you could rapidly travel from one end of the empire to the other, and it's kind of the first of its kind in the ancient world. So he goes to Marathon. So the very famous one, which is where the Persians show up, and then somebody runs and warns all of the Greeks, and he runs 26 point whatever miles it is that a marathon is. And who would think that, you wonder, as the guy's running, if he realizes, because of you, for thousands of years, people are going to do really ridiculous things, go out and run just for the fun of it for 26 miles. Anyway, so that gives you an idea where we're at, historical time period. At this point, Darius is defeated at Marathon, and so then he goes back and continues to rule over Lydia. I believe he also conquered up into Thrace here a little bit, but I just didn't get that on the map. Now, Darius builds up Persepolis, and this is some of the ruins that are there. What's amazing is they're out in the middle of the mountains in Iranian area, and there's not a lot of water, and they had systems of bringing water through the mountains to the city that would marvel even what we got today. Sometimes we look back at this ancient world and we don't realize many of these places had plumbing. Many of these places had flowing water and sources of water, and they used engineering to do so, a lot more than what we would imagine. So after Darius, then you have King Xerxes, and he is thought to be Ahasuerus, which is the king at the time of Esther. So this would be Esther's husband, or Hadassah's husband. He spent the first few years putting down rebellions, and then sought to avenge his father's loss against the Greeks, and does a campaign into Greece. And the army he assembles is just massive. So when he goes in, at first he's successful on land. He comes in and he gets to Thermopylae. Now, when you see Greece, this part right here, that's actually an island. And you're not, or at least it's disconnected here. You're not able to come down here and come across. So he has to come along this area. And Thermopylae was a place where it's just a very, very small, skinny strip of land that you'd have to pass through. And so the Greeks went there to try to stop them, and probably would have done quite well to stop them except for the fact that somebody eventually told the Persians how to get around it. And it was a kind of a secret way. But this is where, the movie, which I do not recommend because it's about as historically inaccurate as you could possibly be, not to mention gory and inappropriate, but 300, which was a movie a few years back, was all about this battle because it's where the Greeks took their stand against Persia. Hilarious thing with that is there's this thing with the story where they're like, yes, these free Greeks took their stand against Persia. No, it was King Leonidas. Okay, wait, let's say this again. King Leonidas standing against the king of Persians. This isn't it was, anyway, either which way it was kings. So after Thermopylae, they move on down to Athens, and they burn Athens, and things look pretty dire. But then the navy that they put together, the Persians, comes in to the area here where Athens is right on the shore here. Salamis is right on there, and they kind of came in. And what happened is the Greeks pretended to run. They took their fleet and they turned around, hightailed it out of there. Persians started to pursue them, only to come right into the middle of where the Greeks were on both sides and able to come in and just take their ships out. So it was a brilliant naval victory, and that resulted in Xerxes heading back and letting his captains continue, but then he ends up just giving up on Greece entirely. He goes back and begins a building program, and so he's back in Persia now. This is likely when the story of Esther happened. So after the Battle of Marathon, after those things, you have Esther. He comes back having this big feast and the whole thing with his wife at that time. And thus we have our story in Scripture. Also, to put this in historical context, this is when Socrates is born. So Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates is the first of those three. So to give you guys an idea of this ancient Greek philosophical stuff happening at the very, very tail end of what we have in the scriptural account. Xerxes was then assassinated by the commanders of the palace guard, which is interesting because in Esther, you have an assassination attempt being thwarted, but eventually one got through. So Artaxerxes Longimanus is referred to as such partly because of the length of his reign. To have a 40-year reign was pretty long at that time. He first disposed of the rivals to the throne, and then, he made a treaty with the Greeks, and then the Greek cities in Asia Minor began to ally themselves with Athens instead. So all of these areas he conquered into the far end of Turkey, they're now starting to ally with all of the, with Macedonia and with Athens and such like that. And they're starting to rise up more and more against the Persians. And really, from this point on, the Persians are on the defense, and they no longer go any further. And the Greeks begin to get bolder and bolder and bolder and more successful until we get to Alexander the Great and the conquering that he does. All after Artaxerxes Longimanus are weaker rulers. And the one that faces Alexander the Great is Darius the, second or third, I think. But they don't factor into the biblical account, and they don't really factor into strongly into the history either. So it's during this time. So that was kind of the basic overall political history. So we're kind of going back. What are these returns, and what do we see in Scripture? So when you had the return of the Jews from Babylon back to Judah, this message goes out to the entire empire. So even the Israelites that are scattered up in this area know of it, find out about it, and they also join in. So you do have some from the lost 10 tribes that are coming back to Judah and being part of those returns. The Chabar River that you see here, this area, this is where a lot of the population of the Jews are. But we find out, with Esther, that there's Jews all throughout this area. They've spread throughout Babylon and moved around in the time that they were there. So with the returns, First, you have the Edict of Cyrus, which, interestingly, is the Edict of Cyrus is actually mentioned in 2 Chronicles. So you'd expect it not to be, wait till Ezra, but Chronicles kind of just jumps the entire 70-year captivity and talks about the Edict of Cyrus, and then you pick it up with Ezra as well. So the edict basically says the temple and Jerusalem both are to be rebuilt, and that the funds are going to come from his personal treasury, and that the temple vessels taken by Nebuchadnezzar will be returned. So the very fact that the temple to Yahweh is going to be funded by Cyrus the Great and paid for by him was a huge provision for the Jews, and probably a big sign to them of God's blessing. So the first return then that occurs is led by someone named Sheshbazzar. He's called the Prince of Judah. We have in 1 Chronicles 3:18 a Shenazar, who's a grandson of Jehoiachin. So this is likely in the royal line, and he is leading this first return back that's recorded in Ezra 1:5 and 2 through to 270. In this return, Josephus records 42,462 returning at this time. That's a little bit closer to the number we see in Ezra for the second return, but Josephus has that the second return was just massive. He has far more than what we see in Ezra. The rebuilding of the Jerusalem and the temple we see in Ezra 3 through 6. And so they begin to construct the temple and rebuild Jerusalem. The first thing that they do is they build an altar, and there is a celebration at the rebuilding of the altar. But when this altar is built and you have this first Feast of Tabernacles celebrated, the Samaritans in the land, who had kind of been the dominant ones, they came and said, "Hey, we worship Yahweh too. Let us help build the temple." And they're like, "No, you can't. You're not actually part of us. You don't worship as we do, and you can't help us." Well, then the Samaritans got mad, and they write a letter to Cambyses and say, "Hey, these guys, don't you remember how bad these guys were? Go look in the histories, and you'll see this group of people rebelled all the time, and this city was a constant thorn in the flesh of the other empires." And Cambyses does that, and he looks and he finds out that they were, and that's how it was recorded. And so he puts a halt on the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the tabernacle. And so they don't know, what to do, and everybody is discouraged. This is when you have, oh, come on. My brain just died on me. Micah. I'm just going to have to say them in my head. So you have Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Haggai, and Zephaniah. So Haggai and Zephaniah are writing at almost the exact same time. They tell you that it's during the reign of, I think it's Darius. But anyway, well, I think I'll probably, I don't know if I'll have it later on in the notes, but if not, basically they're prophesying, saying, no, the temple will be built. Don't be discouraged. It will happen. And they're encouraging the people to get back to building the temple. And that's what you see in those two. They give the dates of their prophesying, and you'll see that they're within 6 months of each other. So they're prophesying simultaneously to the people, and everything is about that rebuilding of the temple. Haggai is shorter and is more focused just on the rebuilding of the temple. Zephaniah is longer and has other prophecies that go further and beyond just the rebuilding of the temple, but they're both at that same time. And then, when the rebuilding of the temple happened, it was supposed to be, they were supposed to have actually money from the nations around them to help do it, which may have been why the Samaritans offered, but they didn't accept. So there's this delay after they do actually finally build the temple. There's a delay before you have another return, and then this is So you have the first return. The second first return part 2 led by Zerubbabel. So the first one was by Sheshbazzar. Here you have, it's kind of part 2 of the first return, which is Zerubbabel. Probably, as we say here, the nephew of Sheshbazzar, although some say, you'd read some commentaries, they're like they're the same person, but it would seem that they're different because of the time period we're talking about. So Zerubbabel probably was in the first return, but he went back to Persia and is returning again. He was a friend and bodyguard of Darius the Great, who becomes king. And he wins permission to resume the building of the temple in Jerusalem in a battle of wisdom. So this one is recorded in Josephus. You don't see it in Scripture. And what seems to be there in Josephus is that they're asked, which is more powerful, wine, women, or truth? And so they go, different guys say this, and Zerubbabel kind of comes through and says, well, women definitely are more powerful than wine, but truth is more powerful than women, and talks through and says why. And so he ends up being awarded, and the things what he requests is the ability to once again start rebuilding, and so that seems to be why Zerubbabel returns, and there is that rebuilding that occurs even against the Samaritan opposition. At this time, we're told the articles of the temple go with them. You're like, well, didn't they go with the first group? It could be that they brought it in two installments. It could be that they chose not to take them in the first group. Why would you choose not to take them in the first group? Well, we do know at one point with, like when Nehemiah and them, and what was recorded in Ezra, that every time that they made this trip, they wanted to have a guard, because you're traveling pretty far with a lot of money, and the idea of somebody coming and attacking you is high. And so it may be that in the first one they felt there wasn't enough security to take all the articles. They take it in this return, or they took it in 2 installments because of they didn't want to get robbed and lose all of them, kind of thing. And then the number given by Josephus for this return is in the millions. So that's different, but you'll notice that the number for this return in Scripture is closer to what the number for the first return was for Josephus. So there may have been another larger return that's not necessarily recorded in Scripture. So rebuilding Jerusalem and the temple. This is Haggai mentions in Haggai 1:15. The people did not want to begin building the temple because they, I think some of the fear of stirring up the angst of the king. But that's why he sends Haggai to tell them, you should start building the temple. And then Zechariah comes along and further encourages them. See, I knew I had it in the notes eventually. I just had to. So then we have a gap after Zerubbabel. And during this gap is when you have Esther or Hadassah. The basic story, you have Vashti as the queen. She kind of stands up to the king, to King Xerxes. He wanted her to come to his banquet, and so everyone could see how beautiful she was. And she was having her own banquet, and she's like, yeah, no, thank you. And chooses not to submit to that. And so she ends up being deposed. And then Hadassah ends up winning a beauty contest, is renamed Esther, and she becomes queen. And you have her cousin Mordecai, or is it cousin or uncle? Yeah, I think it goes back and forth because the words aren't always super clear in Hebrew as to which is being referred to. So there's a plot to kill all the Jews, and Esther and Mordecai end up thwarting this plan. Now, there's a lot more to the story, but you guys have the book in your Bible. You can go to that. One of the interesting things here with Esther is in the sense that Esther, in contrast to Vashti, does everything she does in a very highly respectful and way in honoring the king, and ends up accomplishing way more than Vashti ever did. So Vashti stood up for herself and stuff like that, whereas Esther was humble she ends up rescuing her entire people, and it's more highly exalted. So it's really kind of interesting to see that contrast. And then you have the another thing of the significance. You see in Esther, you seem to see how large number of Jews were that remained in the land of the captivity, because this is after the first two returns. And then you also can tell that the Jews have a great freedom of movement. And then with Haman, it's kind of the first clear case of anti-Semitism. Now, that's because this is now where the Jews and the Israelites are scattered, and so it's the first attempt to get them even where they're scattered. Whereas before that, they were in the land and people would go against them in the land. Here, it's nope, wherever they're scattered, they're going to try to go after them. You also see in Esther the providential care of God, because really there's no mention of God in it. There is everyone go and fast, before that time, which seems to be that they would be praying, but it's not even really brought up that God did any of what we saw. And then that establishes the Feast of Purim, which is celebrated by the Jews to today. And then in the intervening years, between the returns and now we get to the return with Nehemiah, when we're going to have Malachi and such. But Nehemiah comes 58 years after the completion of the temple. At this point, Judea is a province of a larger Persian satrapy, and the people are getting all settled in. They're in their homes, and the biggest problem that we discover is that they're starting to intermarry again with the surrounding nations. And you realize they understood they had gone off into idolatry before, and it had caused the entire nation to be taken captive and sent away. So now, when they see the intermarriage, it's like, same thing is going to happen. We need to not intermarry. If you don't understand that dynamic, and you read the book of Malachi, and you're reading through Ezra and Nehemiah, where they're having to divorce their Gentile wives and end those marriages, it seems like, why? This seems wrong. It seems harsh. Why is this happening? Understand one thing, and that is that if the wife had converted to Judaism and was, worshiping Yahweh, she would have been considered a convert to Judaism. She would have been considered a Jew. She would not be considered a foreign wife. So when in these books it refers to setting aside the foreign wives, these are wives who clearly believed in other gods, worshipped other gods, and were idolatrous. And so that their fear is that we're going to go back into that. We're going to be done for if we do that. And so now what happens is you have a new royal letter declaring for the people to be able to go back, this time with Nehemiah. And with this letter, it authorizes the collection of funds from Jews in the Persian government, so they can actually collect funds to help build the temple and such. And then the temple becomes exempted from Persian taxation. And then now you also authorizes the Jewish magistrates to use the death penalty. These are advancements in the ability and the governing of Judah. So they have being counted. You have the assembling at the river Ahava, which we don't really know for sure where that is, but we do know it's there near Babylon. And they assembled, they're getting ready to go, but they needed 38 Levites to join them to go on the trip. And that's probably because of material that had to be carried by Levites. And then it also says they're accompanied by the Nethinim, which many think is likely the Gibeonites. Do you guys remember who the Gibeonites are? Who can tell me who the Gibeonites are?
The clever deceivers.
Yep, all the way back to Joshua, the clever deceivers. Look how far we've come from, but they end up becoming servants of the temple. And so that's what many think that the Nethinim are, as the Gibeonites that were serving in the temple. And it shows you how they have completely adapted into the Jewish culture and the Jewish nation. And the journey back took 3 months, which tells you, about how long it would take to travel that with that large of a group of people. And this is where, again, we have the intermarriage and the fear. And so Ezra commands that these marriages be dissolved. But the interesting thing about this is while Ezra and them are commanding that these intermarriages with Gentile nations be dissolved, we all sit there and like, yay, because Esther just married a Gentile pagan king who doesn't believe in God. So it's kind of a, wait a minute here. And that's where sometimes we can make the mistake of going to Esther and treating her as like, oh, here's this great example of a biblical woman and character. And in some ways, maybe, but at the same time, Esther is more about God's sovereign protection of his people, even through those who aren't walking in his ways. Not that Esther is herself this wonderful example. And it's kind of interesting because with Esther, she goes in, she basically is having intimacy with the king before they're ever married, which you would never approve of. It's a Gentile king, and he's a pagan. So that's just caution when you pick up some of the books on Esther, that if they start going that direction of look at how wonderful she was and great example, they're not getting the full story of what was going on there. And then you have the third return. So this is where they were attempting to rebuild Jerusalem and the wall, and the Samaritans are interfering again. This time you have Nehemiah coming, and when Nehemiah comes, they attempt to build the wall. The Samaritans notify Artaxerxes. It's like, they're like, don't you know what this city has done? How rebellious it is. Same thing as what they did before, but now it's to keep them from building up the walls. And that is when Nehemiah gets a report back from his relatives that are in the land and finds out that the work has stopped. Now, Nehemiah at that time happens to be the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. Now, notice how you got Esther, that's right there with Xerxes. You've got Zerubbabel, that was like the bodyguard too. So you see the Jews being in these high placed things, which also speaks to the sovereignty of God in all of these things. So here Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the king, entrusted by the king, and the king actually recognizes that his face is downcast. It's like, what's wrong? And then Nehemiah shares that he's down because Jerusalem is still in ruins. And so he requests leave of the king to go back and repair the walls of Jerusalem. Interestingly, the king is like, yes, you can go, but you have to come back, because that was how good of a relationship they had. And so Nehemiah departs, and he goes to build the wall. And when you read Nehemiah, and you're like, why all the secrecy? Why is he going at night to check out the wall? Why is, what? And why did they seek to build this wall in 52 days? Well, because remember, it took 3 months for the people to travel, there and back. So even though a single person could definitely go quicker, you get a letter that goes to the king and come back. It's like, he's got to complete this wall before the Samaritans can get a letter to the king and get back, and they have more problems. And so that's why he goes out and he's checking out the wall, looking at it, planning it. He plans how to fix it, and does so and organize it so that it can be done very rapidly by assigning it to different groups and telling them to rebuild it. One interesting thing later on in history, just an interesting note, Constantinople has a time where their wall went down just before a great enemy came to attack it. And the way they got the wall built fast was by they basically had like sports teams, and they got the people, this sport team versus this sport team, to compete to see who could build it quicker and stuff. So but anyways, just a side note. So the opposition here is from once they start the wall, comes from Sanballat, who's the governor of Samaria, and they try to stop it, but Nehemiah doesn't stop, and they just continue the building and they complete it. So Nehemiah then, while he's doing that, this is his first term as governor. Judah is only about as big as what you see here. It's not much at all. And it's pretty much like a temple state where everything is just around Jerusalem and a few cities there. The debt of the poor in Judea are forgiven to be able to, encourage the economy and build up Jerusalem. And then once they get the wall done, because of the opposition that they're facing, they have gatekeepers and security that's put up. And then they go into all of the surrounding towns, and they require 10% of each city to move into Jerusalem. So what that tells you is that Jerusalem itself was in such ruins that people did not want to live there. So they went out, they prefer to go and start little small towns, live in small towns. We got that, that's fine. They didn't want to be in Jerusalem. So Nehemiah actually forces them to send people into Jerusalem to repopulate it so that they'll be motivated to build it back up. And it's during this time that Ezra reads God's law to all the people and expounds on it. Now, this is actually the beginning of what I would call preaching. So prior to this time, you had the reading of the law, you had the reading of Scripture. We're not really told that anyone got up and did any sort of preaching. Part of that was because it was written in Hebrew, and everybody knew Hebrew, and everybody kind of knew the history. They knew what was being done. Here, what happens is these people have been gone for 70 years, and many of the people know Aramaic, and they're not as familiar with Hebrew. And so what it says is that Ezra actually builds a podium, gets up on the podium, and he has others there that are scribes and such, and he reads the scriptures and then is explaining it and explaining the meaning of the language, and then others are there in the group saying, hey, did you get that? Did you understand that? And answering questions and stuff like that. And that's the first time we really have something like that occurring where you have to expound on the scriptures because it's now in a language that's a little bit more separated from the people at that time. So when he does, and he expounds on the law, sorry, I've been doing stuff in my house, ripping up my floor into my rooms, and there's all this insulation. So you don't think I'm getting sick. It's just Anyway, you inhale enough of that stuff, and you get hairballs basically. So they read God's law, and when they read God's law, they mourn, they weep, they realize even then that they were greatly in violation of the law, when they weep, God's response is actually don't mourn, don't fast. In fact, have a feast, and not only have a feast, but even consume the fat portions. Now, if you remember what we talked about all the way back, fat portions were reserved to God. They were never supposed to be eaten by the people or even by the priests. They were reserved to God. So, the significance of that is you see the joy in God's heart that the people have realized their sinfulness, realized that, and mourned. And he's so happy about that he's like, let's have a feast, and you even get to have my portion. You even get to take the part that I normally reserve to myself. And so they celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles with great joy at that time. And then they dedicate the walls, which were built in just 52 days. Then Nehemiah returns because he had to. The king had told him, you have to come back. But then he requests and eventually goes back. We don't know how long he stayed for the second term. We don't know if it was permanent or if he went back again. But we just know that he came back a second time. When he comes back, one of the things he has to do for reforms, he has to kick Tobiah the Ammonite out of the temple storeroom. So somehow this guy from the Ammonites had gotten in with the people within Jerusalem, and he was the one that's kind of like overseeing what's going into the temple. It's like, how is this even possible? You're not even a Jew. And so he goes and he kicks Tobiah out, revives the collection of the tithe to help keep the temple up and the priests going. And then they address the disregard for the Sabbath because they had started to no longer honor the Sabbath. And you have the problem of mixed marriage again. So this is when Malachi steps in as a prophet, the very last of the Old Testament books. And he addresses all of the issues. So as you're reading through Malachi, you'll you'll see what's happening with the priests. So Malachi 1, for instance, is like, what is wrong with you? Why are, I wish you would, God actually says, I wish you would just shut the temple doors. Well, what are they doing? Well, the people are bringing sacrifices, but they're like, oh, here's this lame sheep that I got. I'll just get rid of that one. And so all their sacrifices were the worst of their flock, the ones they didn't mind getting rid of, and they were just kind of giving that to God, which in some ways is a very powerful picture to us, in what, how we often give our afters to God and such. And there's this really strong message in there about that lackadaisicalness about their faith. And so Malachi is addressing that, saying that it's even among the priests that this is happening, and then among the people. And this is where he says, bring in the tithe and I will show you how I provide. But when you don't bring in the tithe, you're actually robbing God. And so that's all addressed in Malachi during this time. So this, shortly after this, I'll say shortly, about 100 years after this, where there's a period where we know very, very little. Basically, so like from 445 BC, we have this little bit of term here with Malachi. When that's done, that 100 years in between, we have like 2 stories in Josephus about some brothers in some city over in Babylon, and there's one other story, and then next thing you know, Alexander the Great. So it's like, if you're reading Josephus, it doesn't seem like you're skipping a beat, but you are. You're skipping 100 years in there between the Old Testament time period and Alexander. When Alexander comes, he ends up conquering all of the Persian Empire in a matter of years. So he basically conquers all the way through. He starts in Macedonia, comes all the way through, founds Alexandria, and he founds many. Every one of these stars with an A is an Alexandria that he founded, because he's trying to spread the Greek culture. This Alexandria here in Egypt, however, becomes the Alexandria, and it becomes a place of learning. The Library of Alexandria that burned is one of the big travesties, but it was a place of learning. But Alexandria, when it was founded, was highly Jewish right from the beginning, and became very Jewish over time, so where almost a third of the population was Jewish. And so Alexandria always was a center for Jewish faith. They actually built a temple to Yahweh in Alexandria between the Testaments. There's a temple built down in the Elephantine thing too, but the temple here in Alexandria is actually predicted in Isaiah. And the man, Onias, who wants to build the temple in Alexandria, goes to the Ptolemaic rulers at the time and shows, look, this is prophesied in Isaiah. But even those rulers, Ptolemaic rulers, say, that doesn't seem right. We thought, so it's all on you. If this is unpious, not unbiased, unpious, not very pious of you to do, and you're going against your faith, that has to be between you and your God. We need to be free of that, because we don't think that that may be the best thing. And so he did end up founding that temple, and it fulfills that prophecy. So, but anyways, Alexander continues all the way through. In Gaugamela is where the final battle with the Persians are, where he finally defeats them. He is pursuing, all the way through here, he's pursuing Darius, the king of the Persians at that time. And when he finally gets to Darius, he is handed the head of Darius by one of the client kings over here in the east of the empire, who wanted to please Alexander by killing Darius. But it actually is similar to the David thing, where Alexander is mad at him for killing Darius because he wanted to capture him alive and talk with him and things like that. So the other guy gets killed too. But then Alexander continues on all the way through and conquers all the way. This right here is Pakistan. So he conquers all the way over to Pakistan and the Indus River. And this is where they start encountering elephants. And then they get over here, and this is the first time that you might say a European sees this, like the Indian Ocean. At least for Alexander, they were shocked to see the other ocean that was there. And then they come back. Some come back by navy through here. Others travel by land. When they arrive back in Babylon, this is where Alexander dies. in 323 BC. So 334 is when he first takes off and has that battle. And then basically 11 years later, he's dead, but he's conquered the entire world in that time, and he's only in his 30s. So yeah, he beat all of us, and there's a reason he's called Alexander the Great. This then gets divided into 4 empires, which is why you had the leopard with the 4 heads and the 4 wings, the Ptolemaic, the Seleucid, and then these 2 between Cassander and Lysimachus. These 4 basically went against another Greek ruler who was trying to claim kingship over it all, and the 4 of them went against him at the Battle of Ipsus and won, and then as a result they agreed to each take these areas. And now this is the king of the north, this is the king of the south you have in Daniel, and actually I printed off Daniel 11 for you guys, and I left it on the printer in the office, so if you guys want to have the Daniel 11 with all of the different people in between the testaments that are identified, it's just kind of inserted within the chapter. That's king of the north, king of the south, and now the Jews end up basically being caught between these 2 kingdoms, and these are Greek kingdoms. So from 325 BC until the time of Christ, Greek is actually the primary language in this whole area. And so you think about that, when you get to the New Testament and people are sitting there thinking, well, Jesus, when he taught, he would have taught in Aramaic. No, he especially in Galilee, he would not have taught in Aramaic. It was called Galilee of the Gentiles. It was an area that was predominantly Greek. Everybody would have spoken Greek. Jesus definitely could speak Aramaic, no problem. But when he taught, the people were not as learned. When they say, can anything good come out of Galilee, part of the reason is most people in Galilee couldn't speak Aramaic. There were some that definitely could, but not all could. So a lot of what Jesus taught would have been taught in Greek. And there's actually 2 very telling things about that. One is that when he says to Peter, you are now Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. He distinguishes Peter as Petros, which is masculine, and then he says, and upon this rock, Petra, which is like feminine or neuter, is feminine, I will build my church. So there's a distinction there that is not possible in Aramaic, and that's a very close individual conversation with his closest disciple. The other discussion with Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. The way the Greek language is used there, it would be very hard to see it not having happened in Greek the first time, because the distinction between what's being used, it's Peter, do you agape me? Yes, Lord, I phileo you. Peter, do you agape me? Yes, Lord, I phileo you. Peter, do you phileo me? Yes, Lord, I phileo you. And that's where actually phileo is the stronger of the terms. Like, Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I dearly love you. Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I dearly love you. Do you dearly love me? But that's in Aramaic. It's hard to see that same discussion happening because of the language and stuff. So there's a lot there to say that Greek was predominant. It was predominant enough that by 200 BC, there seemed to be a need and a popularity for the Greek version of the scriptures, which is the Septuagint. It was definitely the more common language being used. Even today, if you go to Israel, there are a lot of people there who know English very well, and English is still the dominant language. What Israel did amazingly in modern times is they resurrected the Hebrew language, which has never been done before. And that's an amazing thing that they did. So there are people that definitely, they know Hebrew because it's taught in the schools. But when they first started, almost everyone was more English speaking than Hebrew speaking. So, all right. That is the end of that. Would you guys like me to go through a quick of the intertestamental times, or do you guys want to just go home and say, let's do it in the fall? And I'm fine either way because I'm tired. Or we do final questions too, if you guys have all overall questions about what we've covered. Anything like that. No preference? You guys are supposed to be helping me with this.
Is this your last session?
Yeah, this will be the I was going to do, so that was kind of the question I had at the beginning. We didn't get a full answer, but in order for me to do the intertestamental lesson, we would have to do it a week after next Wednesday. And so it'd be kind of like this one dangling out in the middle of nowhere in June. And actually, I think that's VBS too at that point. So we'd have to like put it off weeks until I could actually do the final lesson. Now, the final lesson in the original curriculum, this is the final lesson. So like in the course packet, it ends here where we're at, which you can see in the notes. I have notes for what the PowerPoint has that I could show you, but that's actually the first lesson of the New Testament backgrounds class that I'd be giving you the notes to. And that's why I thought, we can just end it here, and then you guys all just commit to be back here in the fall, and you'd get the same notes then. So. But if I show you some of the slides, you'll get the notes later. I just don't have them for you right now.
Is that going to be posted online?
Yes, that one will be online too. Yep. Yeah, the one in the fall. From now on, all the classes that we do, we're going to be doing them this way, online, recorded and posting them. You want to see if we can get Judean to start recording his and posting them. But might mean you have to learn how to get the app on your cell phone and how to function this with the cell phones.
Have to learn that.
Yeah. Yeah.
How come in the Old Testament, when the Jews were disobedient, God would excommunicate them from the people or whatever, from the worship? But when you broke the Sabbath, you were killed. I don't know. I don't know why the harshness there on that one, and some of the other ones wasn't like that. So,
in reality, the harshness of the Sabbath, it's not often that you were killed for the things you were supposed to be killed from. There are a few places where it talks and it says you shall be cut off from your people, and some people don't know if that means like excommunicated or banished, which was a common ancient practice. When Socrates was given the choice, you can drink hemlock or be banished, and he drank hemlock because the shame of the banishment and so on and so forth. So it may be that when it says they should be cast out from the people, or forget their exact wording, that is talking about banishment and not always death. The Sabbath day is one of the hard ones for me because the Old Testament is so serious about the Sabbath day, very serious about the Sabbath day, right up to the end.
And then we changed it.
And so within the church tradition, there's a couple reasons for the changes. One, Jesus, when he comes, kind of redefines the Sabbath day. Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Gets them to understand that it was a privilege to us to be able to sit and rest in God and so on and so forth. There's also a promise with the Sabbath that if you keep it holy and you don't do your own work, God will provide. What happened, though, is when the church started to meet, they started to meet on Sundays. How soon? Well, it's soon enough, it would seem, that what you have in the beginning of Revelation is John on the island of Patmos on the Lord's Day. So already by John in writing of Revelation, you have the idea of the Lord's Day being the first day of the week. So what often is said is that because, as Christianity spread, they met in many of the synagogues, went to the Jews first, then the Gentiles. And in many of those synagogues, the people turned to Christianity, but all the synagogue may not have. And so the Christians may have met the following day in honor of Christ's resurrection being on the first day of the week, but then may have still gone to Sabbath stuff on Saturday as well. But somehow in all of that, we're not told clearly, the practice of churches meeting on Sunday began. But it is really early that the churches are meeting on Sunday. And that would have kind of drawn away some from the concept of the Sabbath. Now, Sabbath just means 7. And so, Sunday is every 7 days. So many churches just took the concept of the Sabbath and put it on the Lord's Day, which is why, when I was growing up, you couldn't buy gas on a Sunday. You couldn't go to a restaurant on a Sunday. A lot of them weren't even open, but even if they were open, you weren't supposed to go on a Sunday. And that was especially true for all those Christian Reformed folk. I remember, first time I dated a Christian Reformed girl, and she got mad at me for gassing up on a Sunday. Yeah, yes, Dale, you know my pain. But yeah, it's like you can't do that. Then you have people who take the passages in the New Testament of some consider one day to be more important, others consider every day to be the same. Then you have the passages in Hebrews that talk about the Sabbath rest that we have in Christ being like a spiritual fulfillment. You have the passage in Colossians where Paul says, don't be judged by new moons and Sabbaths and things like that. So there's a lot of development within the New Testament that says there's a richer, deeper concept of Sabbath that is being fulfilled in Christ than just here's the day, don't do any work. And so that's why theologically there's not been a real clear message from the church through all the centuries of this is the Sabbath and this is not, because it actually is complicated, and the more I've dove into it, it just gets almost more complicated and harder to know for sure how I feel about it. I do feel that something in our life has to exemplify the Sabbath, whether it's a particular day or whether it is a concept of rest in God that we have. Yeah.
When does the Jewish calendar, do the Jews still go by their calendar?
Yes, religiously at least.
Okay.
So their holidays are determined on their religious calendar. Even in the Old Testament times, they had a kind of like a almost like a secular calendar and a religious calendar. Their months and years started at different times. But the biggest thing about the Jewish calendar is that it's a lunar calendar. So every so often we have a leap year where we have to add a day. Every so often they add a month because they're moon to moon. Every new moon is a month period.